Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Matthe Mackenzie's play, Bears. So this is a pro-environmental play in the tradition of what's called indigenous resurgence. Indigenous resurgence is an idea that's been developed by First Nations Canadians, Native Americans, Maori, Aboriginal Australians, and some other groups of indigenous peoples around the world. Basically, what it involves is the reconstruction of indigenous patterns of life, which tend to be built around reciprocity, mutual respect, and stewardship, rather than the settler and capitalist models of ownership, exploitation, use of resources, etc., etc. Indigenous cultures tend to be built, at least in the North American indigenous tradition, and among the Maori, among Aboriginal Australians, groups like this, the Sami in northern Scandinavia. These cultures tend to be built around networks of, you want to say interpersonal respect, but it's not interpersonal as such, because while these systems of reciprocity and mutual concern definitely do function in human relationships, they also control how indigenous peoples interact with the natural world, with flora, with fauna, with waterways, with geographic spaces, geological spaces, etc., etc., and with spiritual spaces, with the mythological world. And so Bears is definitely in that vein. The basic storyline is we follow a guy named Floyd, who is First Nations, maybe Metis. It's not 100% clear from the play. Mackenzie himself is a Metis playwright. Let me see here. It says he is a multi-award-winning Metis playwright from Edmonton, Alberta. So the Metis, for those of you who don't know, the Metis are kind of a sort of mixed ethnic group that split off and developed their own distinct culture. They were typically, or their ancestors at least, were typically the result of intermarriage or non-married sex, rape, whatever it was, between indigenous people and European colonists. So they're a sort of mixed race ethnic group that developed as their own nation with their own distinctive culture that combines elements of traditional indigenous First Nations cultures with elements of settler colonial culture. And so Floyd may be Metis, he may be a First Nations person. It's not 100% clear, and it's not super important in terms of the structure of this play. So he had worked in the oil industry for basically his entire adult life. He had been a pipe fitter, he had cleaned up industrial spills, etc., etc. He'd done a lot of different jobs. And finally, he sort of has this revelation that what they are doing is destructive of the world, that it is actively destroying the world. And so it's never necessarily explicitly stated, but it's strongly implied that he essentially sabotages a pipeline in order to try and undercut the company's ability to continue functioning, at which point he is wanted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, and he heads out for the Rocky Mountains, headed toward the Pacific. As he does this, he is transformed into a bear, which is an animal that he has all of his life had a very strong affinity for and sort of spiritual connection with. And so he reflects throughout this journey on humanity's impact on the natural world and on the importance of the environment. So we start with him as a human, still just sort of thinking about nature and the natural world. So it says here, toward the beginning of the play, Floyd wondered what life would have been like for the last grizzlies of the plains. They dwelt in the mountains because it was a refuge, not because they chose to be confined to the range. There was a reason grizzlies could run at over 40 clicks. They were equipped to bring down antelope and deer, moose, and elk. And then a little bit later, Floyd couldn't help but recall that songbird populations on the prairies had been off the charts when the buffalo used to roam. Tattlers, thrashers, and yellow-rumped warblers feasting on the insects that fed on the vast herds dung. And so while we don't initially get that critique of human activity, it's implied from the beginning. This idea that the major change that has occurred is that human beings have come along and human activity, particularly settler colonial capitalism, has been devastating to these native species. A little bit later, we get this connected a bit more directly as Floyd is starting to make his transition into a grizzly bear, and as he's becoming sort of increasingly aware of the way that he is interacting with nature. So it says here, having crossed the threshold into one of the last corners of the world free from pesticides and cell phone signals, Floyd tried not to step on any of the small army of honeybees who were getting down and dirty in the floral cacophony. So this is kind of the thing that we get, and it becomes increasingly overt over the course of the play that this is an environmentalist play, that this is a direct critique of the ways in which settler capitalism, or settler colonialism and capitalism has failed as a method of environmental stewardship, the ways in which the life choices that those of us under settler colonialism and capitalism have made are in fact detrimental to the environment, and the need to reconnect with the environment in order to make the world sustainable. We get that perhaps most directly in this sort of vision that Floyd has toward the end of the play. It says here, staring up into the heavens, Floyd got a sneak peek into the future. A sneak peek after a supertanker had run aground in Burritt Inlet, millions upon millions of kiloliters of bitumen descending into the sacred waters. Without warning, the salmon stopped running, with their kind pretty much disappearing. The grizzlies would return year after year, staring into the streams and rivers, stubbornly willing them to produce salmon, their numbers slowly dwindling. And then with the grizzlies gone, the forest started dying, starved of the nitrogen it survived on. Incidentally, that's brought up earlier in the play that one of the major sources that allows forests to remain fertile in the Pacific Northwest is the nitrogen from the decay of half-eaten salmon, partially eaten salmon that grizzly bears don't finish. Those nutrients are crucial to the ecosystem of the forest. So he says, it goes on, trying to undo what had been done, cleanup crews dredged the sacred waters of Burritt Inlet, but all they'd pull up was death. So we get this fairly overt critique here. And throughout this play, one of the things that consistently happens is that Floyd is warned by various creatures about danger. So he is warned by, I think it's a gopher that's first, or a prairie dog that's first, that warns him about an RCMP patrol looking for him, so he manages to evade them. He gets caught in an avalanche, and he is sort of directed back toward the surface by some birds, by chickadees, I think specifically. He gets caught in a river, and he's being pulled downstream, and some otters help him. There's a bunch of different creatures that help him out in various ways over the course of the play. And at the end of the play, when he's gotten to the Pacific, he ignores the warnings from the other creatures, even though he knows that the RCMP are coming for him. He decides that he's going to make a stand. He's now fully a grizzly bear, and so he turns to confront the RCMP officers. And sort of the upshot of this is a thing that was initially said to him by his mother, and that gets sort of repeated a couple of times throughout the play. No one can frighten us. We can only frighten ourselves. We must stand together for justice in this world. And so that's basically the end of the play, is this sort of call to action to return to these reciprocal relationships and this method of being in the world that is rooted in the idea of stewardship and of caring for the natural world, being responsible to the natural world in this way. I like the idea of it. I like the ethos of it. What I'm somewhat less sold on is the actual performance techniques here. All the stuff that I had read to you was dialogue, but it reads like exposition. I mean, there's no real dialogue in this play, which is usually what dramas consist of. And it's also not really like a monologue play. Because usually with a monologue play, a character speaks in first person, and they talk about their experiences, their perceptions, things like this. In this play, Floyd speaks in the third person and describes the things that are happening to him or that he's doing. I think it's very, very odd to read it. I think if I actually saw this performed, it would be much more interesting. But as a reader, it doesn't really make that much sense to me as a play. So, I don't know. Mixed feelings about it in that sense, because I do think the ecological and cultural work that the play is doing is really, really interesting and important. I'm not a huge fan of the execution, if I'm honest.